Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk here at the IDE lunch seminar series. A disclaimer in the beginning, I'm going to speak here as a policy advisor. So I'm not so much going to talk about what's going to happen in the year 2100, but rather about what can we do today as societies and as policymakers. And the first thing which we can do today is to have a discourse as a society about how technology is changing the world of work in our societies. And that's exactly what we did in Germany. We ran a dialogue process called Work 4.0. So why do we talk about Work 4.0? Well, we believe that with every structural change of how we produce things, how we run our economies, how the industrial setup of our society looks like, the way work is organized and designed also changes. So while we used to live in a world of Work 3.0, we are now entering a phase where work is becoming more interconnected, more digital, more flexible. There's a new way of how humans and machines interact. And the question is, how do we design the institutions, the setups, the rules for this new world of work? And that's exactly the subject of our dialogue process, Work 4.0. A second thing that is important about this dialogue process is, while we used to have a discussion in Germany about Industry 4.0 around 3 years ago, which was very much focused on technology, we tried in this dialogue process to take a more holistic approach. So yes, of course, technology is a major shaping force when it comes to the future of work, but you also have an ongoing globalization and value change, value networks developing around the globe. You have forces on the side of society and culture that are changing in terms of generations, the role of gender, the needs and expectations people have towards their work. And if you want to design the future of work, you have to take all these three factors of technology, economy, and society into consideration. So what we did, we started with a green paper stating the major questions that have to be answered. Then we entered in a phase of dialogue with all the important association NGOs in Germany, with the general public, and of course with different experts from different fields. And what we ended up with was a white paper. And this white paper can be considered as the reference document of our dialogue process. It's trying to describe the major trends and drivers, what is changing society, what is changing our economy. It's trying to give an outlook on what could decent work look like in the digital age, and it's offering some kind of policy menu when it comes to shaping labor and social policy for the future of work. And as these are almost 300 pages, I obviously will not present you all of the issues that have been raised in this white paper, but rather focus on three different themes. The first one being employment and skills. I'm showing you this cover of the German political magazine Der Spiegel. They did last year kind of a remake of a story they already did in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the headline was "Progress makes us all unemployed," and this time it's "You are fired," where a robot is literally taking someone by his hands, a human being by his hands, out of the office. What this is showing us is that in Germany at the moment we have a debate that is very much fueled by an anxiety that technology, digital technologies, might lead to massive unemployment. And this debate got some kind of academic backing, so to say, by the study I guess most of you are aware of, by Fry and Osborne from Oxford University. They did this study saying that 47% of jobs in the US could be exterminated by technology in the next 10 to 20 years. When you take a different approach, a little bit more sophisticated, so not only looking at occupations, but rather on the tasks people are actually performing, and when you use self-report individual level data, then you come up with quite different numbers. So the studies we see in Germany come up with numbers of 10 to 15% of people in the workforce being in jobs that may be exterminated due to technologies in the next 10 to 20 years. This is still a substantial number, but obviously quite lower than 47%. And what we try to do in this dialogue process is also to work a little bit against this 47%, we are all doomed, we are all going to become unemployed in the future, by providing some more solid academic backing to what's actually going on. So if you raise the question, are robots coming for our job? Because, I mean, this is an issue you find in the headlines and many papers, articles and magazines all over the developed world. Yes, in Germany as well, we saw a decrease in manufacturing employment in the last 20 years. And this decrease was indeed at least partially due to the introduction of robots. You could roughly say that 1/4 of the decline in manufacturing employment in Germany can be attributed to the rise of robots. But then when you compare the US and Germany, what's interesting to see is while in the US the exposure to robots leads to an increase of job stability for those being exposed, in Germany you see a slightly different picture. So the exposure to robots leads to an increase in job stability at the worker level, both for high-skilled workers and for medium-skilled workers performing routine and manual tasks. But the difference between them is that the wages develop quite differently. So for high-skilled workers, being exposed to robots leads to increasing wages, while it leads to decreasing wages for medium-skilled workers. A second thought that's debated in Germany at the moment is how is the interplay of demographic change and technological change? Because although we had an influx of refugees in the past 2 years in Germany, a quite substantial one, the predictions still are that we are going to see a decrease in the size of the labor force in Germany. And this picture is particularly more dramatic when you look at different regions in Germany. So specifically in the east of Germany, we are going to see a fastly aging population. And some argue that technological change so automation might come in handy, as it could compensate for demographic change. This again then raises the question of matching people to jobs, and that's not as easy a question as it assumes to be. Then this kind of rather optimistic view we have been developing in Germany does not mean that we don't see massive structural change. We do see a massive structural change going to unfold in the next 2 decades. This applies to sectors, so our predictions are that while the net is going to be neutral to positive, there are going to be substantial shifts between the sectors. So particularly jobs in public administration, trade and logistics, and production probably decreasing, while IT, research development, services, so B2B services, are going to increase. This change also applies when you look at the level of occupations. You could say what is going to be needed in the near future when it comes to occupations are those building the future, so in production, science and IT, those running our future societies and organizations, so people in management jobs, and reflecting on what kind of world we are constructing for ourselves, so humanities and culture. That's quite interesting to see that this is a group of occupations that we expect to grow in the nearer future. And then, quite obviously, when you look at the level of education, we expect a substantial increase in the demand for university-educated people, while the demand for people without any degrees is going to decrease. What is important to underline is that this kind of optimism we are articulating is based on certain conditions. So all these predictions I presented to you are based on a scenario where we invest in continuous education, where digital skills are a part of vocational training, where we invest in digital capital goods, where the acceptance of the digital transformation on the side of the general population is high. So given these factors, we assume that the effect of automation and the digital transformation on the future of work is going to be a rather positive one. But this positive scenario kind of hints at the challenge that is in front of us, because the skills agenda that has to be developed in the near future in Germany is determined by three major factors. One being uncertainty. So what exactly is the nature of future labor demand? What kind of skills are actually going to be needed? That's not so terribly sure. I mean, we all talk about non-routine jobs, but exactly what non-routine part of jobs are going to be needed in the future. Then secondly, pace. Change is coming at an increasing pace. Some even say at a pace not seen at this level so far. And then thirdly, the issue of diversity. So both workers and business models are becoming increasingly diverse, which is a major challenge. So uncertainty, pace, diversity, that's kind of the goals or the factors describing the challenge for coming up with the skills agenda. Then what's on the policy menu for developing such a skills agenda? I guess in the short term, what we are trying to deliver is a better forecasting and monitoring of emerging mismatches between jobs and people, and this also considering demography, skills, regional differences. So we have to be better when it comes to forecasting and monitoring. Then what is discussed in Germany on the with the medium-term perspective is rather about providing some independent skills assessment and maybe some legal entitlement to counseling about continuous education. So where can people go to assess what's the value of their current skill basis, and what kind of steps should they pursue to develop their skills, to invest in their employability. And then with a more longer term perspective, there could be steps imagined towards a more comprehensive prevention paradigm in labor market policymaking. So, for example, what is talked about is legal entitlements to continuous education, or something which is called the opportunity account, which was discussed in this year's run-up to the elections. So the opportunity account could be considered as some kind of counter-proposal to the unconditional basic income, as one might assume that the unconditional basic income is rather likely to increase polarization in times of increasing automation. So the idea of the opportunity account is giving people 10 to 20,000 euros, possibly at the age of 18, and this money can then be used for investments in qualification, in entrepreneurship, or in civic engagement. This is something some people discuss in Germany. Then another point that's quite important to us is that securing employment is very much about designing the man-machine interaction. And there really are two different approaches. So on the one side, you could consider complementarity between man and machine to be technology centered. So you end up with a polarized organization, those on the top designing the machines, programming, writing the code, and those on the bottom basically cleaning up the shop floor. This would end up in like a digital Taylorism and a de-skilling of broad strands of the labor force. While what we propose is something which is a human-centered complementarity where you via job enrichment, job enlargement, for example, you give more planning capacities, planning tasks to those at the shop floor level so that you end up with an upskilling of the workforce. Obviously, that's not easy to do. Then, with regard to skills, there are still some open questions for us because what we see at the moment that the debate very much focuses on the aggregate and a very abstract level. So, what skills exactly are needed? What non-routine part of current jobs? How do skill mismatches develop in specific sectors and regions? These are all open questions for us, and we are very much inviting all academic partners to engage in this kind of discussion. Then, secondly, I would like to speak very briefly about platforms, because I know that in the Anglo-Saxon world, the future of work is very much discussed within the framework of a platform economy. When we look at the case of Germany, we have to say that the platform economy and those working for this platform economy are still a very limited phenomenon. So in a very recent survey we did in Germany, it was around 1% of the workforce actually engaging in crowd work or gig work, around 46% in crowd work, 40% in gig work. And when you then look at the crowd workers, what do they exactly do? It's a mixture between rather simple tasks and more skilled tasks. And when you then look at what role this kind of employment plays for them, it's the main income only for 29%. So this kind of idea that in the future people are going to work on digital platforms, performing skilled tasks, and this is going to be their main income, this is a very limited phenomenon in Germany at the moment. And then when you look at the socio-demographics, it's mostly male, educated, young, urban people. But quite obviously, we do see the potential for disruption because of these business models, and this is something we are monitoring very closely. Then a third theme I would like to talk about is the issue of what do people actually want from the world of work. So what are people's needs? What are people's preferences? And what we did in Germany when we started our dialogue process work 4.0, we started with a very innovative survey, very in-depth, the combination of quantitative and qualitative research, surveying 1,200 people in Germany about what do they like about the current world of work, how do they want the future work of world to look like, and what kind of ideal of a world of work do they actually have. And what we found is 7 very different, distinct world of values, so to say, 7 value systems, from very 1950s style working in a community of solidarity to those wanting to realize themselves in their work, those searching for meaning outside paid employment, while others are very much into high performance, very dedicated to their work. And what's most interesting to us is that one would assume that by socio-demographics we can explain what kind of group someone belongs to. And this is the case, but only to a very limited extent, which means that you find someone in his 50s being in the self-realization value system, for example, or you find someone just coming out of graduate school who wants to live comfortably from his or her work, but who has not this kind of notion of self-realization or dedication when it comes to his or her work. So this is interesting for us to see, because this pluralization of needs and preferences is a major challenge both for policymakers who have to design labor and social policies, but also to HR practitioners within companies. And when we then zoom into the question of digitalization, what we find is, quite interestingly, there is a group of people who considers digitalization as a catalyst for everything which is good about the world of work. So digitalization is increasing speed, is increasing possibilities for self-realization, for a more individualized world of work. While there's another group, for them, digitalization is basically a catalyst for everything which is bad about the future of work. So they are assuming with digitalization, we're going to see more time pressure, we're going to see more a diffusion between what is private, what is professional. But interestingly, the biggest group are those in the middle, who are very much ambivalent. So for them, digitalization is something that is interesting when there is something in for them. So they actually ask, so what will it actually do to my world of work? What will it do to my job? And what we try to do with our dialogue process, coming back to this 47% prediction by Osborne and Fry, and this kind of fear and anxiety about being doomed to unemployment, we try to make the outcomes, the effects of automation, of digitalization, as specific, as concrete as possible, because we want to convince those in the middle that there is something for them, that there is a decent digital future of work when we come together as a society and build up the necessary institution capacities, and so on. Finally, I want to look at small and medium-sized enterprises and at something which we call innovation spaces, because as in most advanced economies, small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of the German economy. It's roughly 3.6 million companies providing more than 60% of all jobs in Germany. And we believe that HR practices, human resources practices, are actually crucial for securing skilled labor within small and medium-sized companies, but also for their competitiveness in the digital age. But what we observe when we look at recent surveys, there is a lack of awareness in some of these small and medium-sized enterprises. So what we want to do, we'd like to address this lack of awareness. So we want to promote innovation spaces. So what are innovation spaces? When you look at the debate about human resource practices, you find this notion of humanization of work, so job enrichment, job enlargement, these kind of some concepts that have been quite prevalent in the 1970s and 80s. Then in the 90s, 2000s, we talked about high-performance work practices. For example, Paul Osterman here at MIT. And nowadays, we are mainly talking about agile management practices, about design thinking. And what we believe that while these approaches are not the same, they have certain characteristics in common. So, for example, letting employees participate in processes of innovation, a human-centered approach, focusing on the employee and his or her capacities. So what we try to do with this notion of innovation spaces to start a discussion in Germany on how we can elaborate HR practices in Germany, particularly in small and medium-sized companies. So we started this online platform called Experimentierräume, so innovation spaces, where we try to showcase new practices, where we introduce experts on different issues of HR practices in the digital age, where we try to connect the early adopters of SMEs, and where we describe different ways of funding innovation spaces within SMEs. With regard to the questions being answered in this innovation spaces, that this can be leadership, skills, man-machine interaction, big data, AI, all these kind of questions. So how does such an innovation space look like? Just to give you two examples of companies we feature on our website. So there's, for example, the Bosch plant in Abstadt. They are basically producing powertrain units, for example, the autonomous driving system for the Tesla, in two divisions, so sales and R&D. They are using agile and scrum methods, focusing on the velocity of work, on collaboration, on transparency. And this is actually a real-life laboratory in one unit of this big company, with the idea of learning from this laboratory and then in the end thinking about how can we transfer this to a company of 300,000 employees. Another example being Traumferienwohnung, so a small startup from Bremen in the north of Germany, some kind of competitor to Airbnb, so to say. So they are a platform for holiday homes. They are experimenting with no hierarchies, cross-functional teams focusing on the creativity and job enrichment for their employees. So these are two examples of how these innovation spaces look like. And what we are just starting now is a program where we allow SMEs to visit one of 100 consulting centers all over Germany, where they are introduced to a very robust agile process to address the crucial questions of digital transformation in small and medium-sized companies. And this kind of consultancy is then partly funded by public money. And the crucial questions can be business models, innovation strategies, work organization, how to secure skilled labor, leadership, career development, all these issues. And our goal is to use this program of consultancy to, in the end, reach out to 2,000 companies in Germany. Obviously, 2,000 companies does not equal the 3.6 million SMEs in Germany, but when you see that Germany is very much organized in clusters, we believe that we might approach some of the early adopters and that we are going to see a diffusion of innovative and promising HR practices to the world of SMEs in Germany. So that was a very broad picture of what we did in our dialogue process Work 4.0. I mean, obviously, many more issues, many more topics to talk about. So I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A and to your questions. Thank you very much.
How do you see things different in the United States versus Germany? I mean, you spent some time between the two. Are there some things that can be learned, transported directly, or are there some things that are different? Are there even some things that I think the United States is doing better?
Yeah. So I think when you look at the structure of the labor force, you have a far stronger segment in Germany of medium-skilled workers due to the dual education training system. And I think this is kind of an opportunity.
These are people with sort of vocational training or some college.
Yeah, and it's dual because they go to school, so vocational school, but at the same time they're working in the company. And they're always changing on a kind of weekly basis between school and going to the company. And we believe when we do it in the right way, we kind of update this model to digital age, this is a great asset for Germany. Because what we're not going to see in Germany is hollowing out of the middle.
Can you put some numbers to that? I've heard a lot about this. Do you happen to know what the numbers or the percentages are?
So how many people do this? Or,
yeah.
I don't know. It's like, I would say like 35, 50%. So the a big chunk of the labor force is the dual vocational training. I think what a big asset of of the US is obviously is coming up with business models because like in the whole digital sphere, what Germany did not really manage is to come up with a B2C, like a really successful B2C model. So for example, you had SoundCloud, which was a successful company in Germany, which is about to, I mean, they're going to see 2 or 3 more years and they're going to be doomed actually. So coming up with B2C business models in digital age, that's a tough thing for Germany. And then I think this ambidextry of the old logic of how to run a country and the new logic. Because I mean, in Bosch, it's 50 people or 60 people working in this innovation space. Bosch has 300,000 employees worldwide. So the question is, how do you roll out this model from 50 people to 300,000 people? And how the big German companies actually manage this ambidextry between an actually new logic of how to run a company, I'm not that much optimistic that it's going to work. That's why we're running this program. So kind of management practices, that's where the US is very strong, I think. Social partnership and educational system, that's where we're very strong in Germany, I'd say. But both sides can learn from each other quite a bit at the moment.
Last slide, you mentioned the goal to consult like 2,000 companies. Yeah. But I think that 2 slides before you talked about 3.6 million small and medium enterprise. How is 0.0?
It's like spilling water on ourselves. That's totally true.
How do you assess this?
Because we believe a little bit in trickle down. We believe a little bit in kind of, I mean, not all of these 3,600,000 companies are aware and actually willing to engage in these kind of programs. So when we manage to find 2,000 companies that are willing to engage in this program, then we are lucky, right? So we have to find the early adopters, we have to convince them, and then hopefully, because Germany is very much organized in clusters, right? We have like industry clusters in different regions. The point is, when you get the early adopters within these clusters, then normally you see some kind of network effect, some kind of trickling down from the early adopters to other companies. At least that's what we hope at the moment. But yeah, that's a big challenge.
Is there thinking in Germany, or I guess broadly in the EU, about the way that I know data regulation is a little bit stricter, so thinking about generalized AI or automation, like sort of the effect that data regulation will have on the ability for AI to replace some jobs?
Yeah, I think in Germany at the moment we have this kind of sentiment that that it's possible to have both. So the same level of data protection plus all the new business models. And I think we're going to have a debate about how much trade is actually possible, right? So how much decrease in privacy protection are we accepting or willing to see for seeing the rise of new business models? And it's not totally a zero-sum game or so, right? But I mean, there is some kind of accepting a reduction of like data privacy and securing data rights and stuff. But I mean, especially, that's also a point we talked about before. You have to see all these SMEs. They are very competitive and very specialized products, right? And these products, they are mainly about knowing the production process perfectly. And the knowledge about this production process at the moment is actually in the head of people, right? So it's very much internalized in skilled labor. What you have to do is to externalize it. And then you have this externalized knowledge in the cloud, for example. And that makes German SMEs very fearful of what's going to happen with the data, because their competitive edge is about the knowledge about the process. That's a big discussion in Germany at the moment.
Will you make a comment about the liberalization of the German market for the innovation-driven companies, which are a small fraction, and for the rest of the industrial structure?
Yeah.
I mean, there is increased liberalization. What does it mean? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah. I mean, what we were seeing this year the highest number of employment ever in Germany, which was due to this liberalization. So when your goal is to have the maximum, the peak of employment, these policies have been successful, I would say, right? But then I think what we're kind of good at is kind of to reform the institutions around the standard employment relationship. Like when you're entering the digital age, you're going to see new forms, new employment relationships. And what we have to build at the moment is the institutional setup around these new forms of employment relationship, right? So
more unstable or less unstable? Which way is it going to go?
Well, I mean, the first thing is actually to safeguard the current system. system. So someone working in the production plant for Volkswagen, he's going to see the same level of security, social protection, and so on, as he's seeing at the moment. But then again, you're going to see people working for crowd working platforms, for example. So what kind of institutional setup in terms of social policies do you build for them? And these institutions are still not there at the moment. And as it's 1% of the labor force at the moment, we are somewhat reluctant to build these institutions at the moment, but we have to build this institution. That's one of the biggest challenges.
Do you have a vision of what those institutions are? I mean, in Denmark, your neighbor, there's some flex security, kind of portable benefits. People talk about the United States to make it less linked to an employer. How closely are benefits linked to employers in Germany? Yeah, in Germany,
they are very closely linked, actually. So Stephen Hill, for example, a journalist from the US, is suggesting that Germany should introduce a more portable safety net, right? I think we are going to move in this direction of flex security, although the term flex security doesn't sound very nicely to German ears. Well, because it sounds like liberalization, neoliberalism, so it's not like a very nicely received notion in Germany.
The second part of it's security.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that part doesn't resonate.
Not really, no. Although I would say that's exactly the direction we have to take in Germany, flex security. Yeah, absolutely. Because in the end, I mean, all the slides I showed in the beginning is we're going to see more dynamic in the labor market between sectors, between occupations. So then again, you have to build a system where people are fine with actually changing employees because they know when they are falling down, there's someone to safeguard them.
When you first started your talk, you were projecting at 2001. We have another 8 years.
Yeah.
Do you have some intermediate projections of what society could be like 40 years out?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of linked to the question you've been raising about the employment relationship and the liberalization, because quite obviously in 40 years we're going to see a world of work that looks different from today. The question is, are we still going to have firms, for example? What is happening to transaction costs and so on? Are we going to see more granular individuals working as kind of free-floating agents? And what kind of setup of institutions do you need for such a world? I mean, that's kind of the thought we have to develop. Then you have the 2100 scenario, which is about singularity. Machines know everything. That's too far away from me, I would say. Say again, sorry.
So like other countries in Europe,
yeah.
Kind of not going to have structure
Why disadvantage?
Well, say Spanish workers for half the wage.
Yeah.
The Eurozone education policy. How does Germany deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say what we envision is a European solution, right? So we believe in mobility of labor. We believe in European companies that are kind of on par with American companies. So that's kind of the vision we are working on. And that's not so easy because, I mean, everything I did and I presented you in terms of analysis and policy menu is very much focused on the nation state, right? So it's not very European solutions, and we have to come up with European solutions. And this is because we don't really have a solid debate on the EU level at the moment about these questions. I mean, on a very general level, what the future of work is going to look like, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, really like institutions, instruments, policy menu, not so much at the moment. So that's what we try to push as kind of a second step of this process. There was another one. Yeah. Yeah.
What about the general population? Like I'm doing a company or industry or top-down company. But it strikes me that in this country, an awful lot of people are unaware of, even data and other jobs like affected by that. And really, all they know
Yeah.
And us getting various ways to their votes or the other way because that's not happening. And they seem unaware of that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's any sense, even if you have a government that's how those
yeah. 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 Yeah, that's why this discussion we're having is not only a technical one, but very much political one. I mean, after the elections here in the US, you had a survey by the Center for American Progress about asking Trump voters, what kind of job would you like to see, like a blue-collar job or a nice white-collar job? And most of them, they want their blue-collar jobs back, right? So what do you do in this kind of situation? I mean, that's to some extent also true in Germany. We just had elections 2 weeks ago with the AfD, so the right-wing party gaining momentum. And this was very much about people actually wanting the world from former times back. So that's why I'm very much trying to make this argument that we have to convince people that there is a bright future where they actually run with machines, not against machines. But also about your question, right, what's the competitiveness of Germany going to be? I mean, we have to convince people in Germany, if you are not willing to work together with technology as an employee, there's going to be someone in China and India who's very much willing to work with technology 8 hours a week, and he's still going to be cheaper than you are. So you have to run with the machines. I mean, that's why we're trying to push for an upskilling where it comes to soft skills, but also all kind of like mathematics and IT skills. Yeah.
I still don't understand this upskilling thing. You gave an example of the harbor.
Yeah.
And there's still some jobs people who don't drive the trucks. But why don't we just replace those drivers with autonomous trucks to get rid of them?
Yeah, we should, because there's also a problem with what I call kind of qualificatory dead ends, right? So you have people working in the plant of Volkswagen producing cars, right? And what they're doing sometimes is to say, well, we're not going to need them anymore because we're going to have robots. These people now are working in logistics, although you know that logistics is the next one to be automatized. So people end up in a dead end. That's a problem. So what you have to do is actual upskilling. So to see for a specific person, you have this skill set, this is future skill needs, how can we bring you from A to B, actually, right? I mean, that's why we are thinking about this consultancy, that's why I think about actually having a legitimate right to skills counseling, to continuous education. Because what we not want is the majority of people to go from A to A plus. We want them to go from A to B, actually, right? To an actually upskilled occupation, upskilled profession, right? Yeah, exactly. That's why we have to work on forecasting and monitoring, and at the same time at skills development, all these kind of institutions that contribute to skill development. Yeah. I think we're going to have like one last one. Yeah. Okay, so let's say it's Chatham House rules. Okay, so it's kind of entre nous. Well, I mean, when you look at what are the future skill needs, right? I mean, this is going to be about like empathy and creativity and working in teams and doing something that actually relates to you as a personality and so on and so on and so on. And now you can ask yourself, how much is the current educational system in Germany contributing to these goals? Not so much. And is there a system imaginable where going to school actually contributes more to this kind of goal? Yes, it is. And it wouldn't be this kind of tripartite system we are having in Germany at the moment. Yeah. So, I mean, the gold solution, the first best option is to work on education, especially early education. But we are an elderly society. So we have many people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who still have to work. So the second best solution is kind of, reskilling, retraining for them. And that's the tougher part, because with regard to early education, we know what to do. We just have to implement it. But actually to work on continuing education, to design workplaces in a way that they actually let skills flourish, that's the harder part. Then we really have to come up with an innovative idea. So there we have a need for innovation. In the other case, it's just like implementation and money.
Early on, you mentioned that Germany hasn't had as much success developing big B2C technology companies. What are your thoughts about why that might be the case? And do you think it might even relate to some of the successes it's had in the other part, that maybe there's more hesitation about disruptive business models that might lay off a lot of taxi drivers or put small bookstores out of business or whatever?
Yeah, I think it's two things. So for example, why has Spotify been successful in Sweden? Not because Sweden has the best IT engineers, but because the general population is very much up for digital technologies, new digital things. So actually they invented these things, and their aunts and uncles started using the technology, and it's kind of diffused. That's not so much the case in Germany. The second thing is, Germany has this old notion of Deutschland AG, so kind of Germany Incorporated, which is a strong network of big companies, big banks, and the government very much intertwined. And the idea of someone coming in and disrupting the market is seen as something kind of ethically wrong, so to say. So, yeah. It's a cultural thing, I would say, to some extent. Should we take one last question, and then we have to end, I guess? Yeah. Yeah. What do you mean, the mentorship? Yeah. Yeah. The trade? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. 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 That's why we call it the dual system, right? And what some companies do in Germany, for example, BMW, is reverse mentoring. So younger people coming in are training their mentors in IT skills. That's, for example, one of the innovation spaces we are funding and fostering. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And our next meeting is November 1st with Michael Jacobides from London Business School. See you then. Here's a small gift for you. Appreciate your coming. Fascinating. Good stuff. I'm glad to learn a little bit. I always hear from the very quickly. Everyone's always talking about the system in Germany as a model for something that's in the United States, and it makes a lot of sense. Get that over here.
Yeah.
Training. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. No, actually, Naomi. Good question there.
Okay.
I'm teaching 3 classes right now. I usually only teach 2, so it's a very busy time for me. So maybe a little tricky finding a time, but it's good to catch up.
Like 6 weeks ago. So.
Okay. Excellent. Perfect. Good. All right. Good seeing you, man.
How are you? Oh, I don't know. Are you going to be around?